A new world order, a new geopolitics. Authoritarian regimes are undermining democracies around the world. Proxy wars are being waged in the corners of Europe, from the Baltic to the Black Sea, from information warfare to military intervention. We've been here before, when an iron curtain cut through Europe. But we came together to break down this wall. We came together to build a future of economic growth, innovation, and cooperation. Today, we face new challenges that seem insurmountable, and in great uncertainty, vision and leadership are more important than ever. A new generation must take a stance against rising authoritarianism. A new generation that believes that what unites us is stronger than what drives us apart. Join us at CEPA Forum 2020.
Hello, and thank you for tuning in to this year's CEPA Forum, Disrupted Future, Shared Purpose, Mapping a New Transatlantic Decade. My name is Geisha Gonzalez, and I am the Senior Director for Programs and Strategy at the Center for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA. It is my immense pleasure to kick off this year's forum. The week ahead, we have very exciting conversations about the importance of the transatlantic alliance and the challenges ahead. But at the end, it's about how we can come together to address these challenges and strategize with our partners and allies on our future. Now, it is my pleasure and immense honor to welcome our chair of our board, Mr. Larry Hirsch, for a word of welcome.
Hello, and welcome to the 2020 CEPA Forum. I'm Larry Hirsch, and I'm chairman of the board of the Center for European Policy Analysis, CEPA. On behalf of Vice Chairman Wes Mitchell and myself, I am delighted to open the 12th annual CEPA Forum and welcome all of you tuning in to this digital event from around the world. This year's theme is Disruptive Future, Shared Purpose, Mapping a New Transatlantic Decade. It highlights the challenges and opportunities the transatlantic community faces in the coming year. Our focus for the next week is on how we can work together to find solutions that will make our alliance stronger and closer. Each day this week will bring together world-renowned thinkers, such as author and professor Frank Fukuyama, decision makers, including NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, and freedom fighters, such as Hong Kong's Nathan Law. We'll recognize exceptional leadership to counter authoritarianism with our awardees, Senator Chris Murphy and Rob Portman, and honor Lithuanian Foreign Minister Linus Linkevičius for his leadership in support of freedom fighters in Belarus and across the world. Since our founding in 2005, we have been committed to strengthening the transatlantic alliance. As we face unprecedented uncertainty and global upheaval, our mission has never been more important. Stay tuned across Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube by following hashtag CEPA Forum throughout the week to join our stimulating conversations. It will be a great forum. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry. And thank you for reminding our audience to use hashtag CEPA Forum as they're following today's discussion. Now, it is my honor to welcome our President and CEO, Dr. Alina Polyakova.
Hello, I'm Alina Polyakova, President and CEO of CEPA. Welcome to CEPA Forum 2020. As we look into the future, it looks incredibly uncertain, unpredictable, and even disruptive. We live in a contested world with unprecedented global challenges disrupted by competition from Russia and China, ongoing crises, and the rapid digital transformation of our societies. In the near term, the international order will look drastically different from what it does today. In these uncertain times, CEPA's mission to strengthen shared transatlantic values and to build on the basis of those values a stronger, better prepared, and more resilient alliance of democracies is more relevant than ever. This is CEPA Forum 2020, Disrupted Future, Shared Purpose. This week, we will bring you discussions and debates on the challenges facing the transatlantic relationship. And most importantly, we will strategize on how to solve them together. To be sure, we will need to think of new ways, new avenues, and new mechanisms for working together to ensure our collective defense and security. We will need to find the vision, courage, and perseverance to re-energize democratic values, just as the 1989 freedom fighters did more than 30 years ago. Like them, we will have to fight for our democratic future. We will need to ensure that emerging technologies are channeled in productive ways to support our democratic societies, rather than being exploited by those who seek to undermine us. We must ensure that new technologies are rooted in a democratic framework and values and principles, while still maintaining our innovative competitive edge against China and others. And to achieve all this, we will need leaders who are committed and undeterred in the face of adversity, and those who have the vision to bring us together in our common purpose. Because it is only together that we can overcome the many challenges that face our societies today. And with that, I have the great pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker for the 2020 CEPA Forum, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. As an organization of dedicated Atlanticists, it is a true honor for CEPA to welcome Secretary General Stoltenberg. Since our founding, CEPA has been committed to advancing the work of the Alliance to ensure our collective defense and security. After commemorating its historic 70th anniversary last year, NATO undoubtedly remains the most successful alliance in history. But today, the rapidly changing security environment is pushing NATO to refocus its mindset, to tackle challenges both new and old. Defense no longer only happens on land, air, and sea. It increasingly happens in cyberspace and the information environment. And Russia is not the only risk to our shared security. China's global influence poses strategic concerns for the alliance. It is a challenge to our security, but also, and perhaps more importantly, a challenge to transatlantic values and principles. The reality of global health crises, emerging disruptive technologies, and climate change foreshadow a future filled with increasingly complex threats. These threats can only be addressed through deeper and more global cooperation. We are facing a disrupted future, but we share a common purpose as an alliance. As the world continues to change, so too must NATO. And to help it do that, the alliance must look to the next generation of transatlantic leaders who will soon be taking its reins. Recognizing all this, the Secretary General recently launched a forward-looking reflection process. It is designed to strengthen NATO's political role and best position the alliance for 2030. CEPA has been proud to support this process through our close cooperation with NATO's Public Diplomacy Division and through our very own Board Vice Chair, Wes Mitchell, who's serving as the U.S. co-chair of the NATO Reflection Group. And we are thrilled to have Secretary General Stoltenberg with us today to share some of his own vision for NATO 2030. As a former Prime Minister of Norway and UN Special Envoy, Secretary General Stoltenberg has always been a strong advocate for transatlantic cooperation. A skilled diplomat, with an impressive record of public service, his leadership has helped NATO innovate for new challenges, enhance partnerships, and even welcome new members into the alliance. NATO is surely stronger thanks to all of his efforts, and we greatly look forward to hearing more of his reflections about what NATO must do to prepare for the decade ahead. Mr. Secretary General, thank you for your leadership, your commitment, and for being with us today.
Madam Polyakova, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure to be able to address this forum because the work of CEPA is of great value for our alliance. So I want to start by thanking you for your relentless support. We even have your own Wes Mitchell co-chairing the group I have appointed to support me in my effort to develop NATO into the next decade, NATO 2030. Allied leaders asked me to carry out this forward-looking reflection when they met last December in London. I have called it NATO 2030, and it has three priorities: keeping NATO strong militarily, making NATO stronger politically, and ensuring that NATO has a more global approach. Let me briefly go through each of these priorities. First, keeping NATO strong militarily. Our alliance is already strong. We are delivering on our military responsibilities with the biggest reinforcement of our collective defense in a generation. With modern capabilities, higher readiness of forces, and increased investments in defense. This must continue, and all allies must meet their commitments. We know that prioritization of defense spending in the middle of a health crisis is not easy. But the military threats that existed before the pandemic have not diminished. On the contrary, some actors are exploiting this crisis to undermine NATO and to advance their own interests. So the commitment we all have made to spend more on defense has to stand. And it is important that we achieve fair burden sharing by investing more in our security. We also see the value of our militaries in responding to the current crisis. Our troops have delivered hundreds of tons of critical supplies around the world. They built almost 100 field hospitals and helped to secure borders, disinfect public spaces, and save lives. This all shows that investing in our armed forces is an investment in a stronger and safer society for us all. The second priority is to strengthen NATO as a political alliance. NATO is a unique political platform. It is the only organization that brings together countries across Europe and North America to discuss security issues of common concern. We need to seize the opportunity that this represents and use NATO even more as a forum for frank discussions on a range of different issues. From the conflict in the Middle East to global arms control and the security consequences of global warming. Using NATO more politically is valuable to send a clear and unified political message. Because together, NATO allies represent half of the world's economic and military might, and nearly 1 billion citizens. So what we say matters. Recently, we have sent a strong political message to the government in Belarus, calling on it to respect fundamental rights, including freedom of speech and the right to peaceful protest. We have also strongly condemned the Novichok attack against Alexei Navalny. And I've urged Russia to conduct a full and transparent investigation into this horrific attack. It was not just an attack on one individual, but on fundamental democratic rights. It is also a serious breach of international law and of an arms control treaty, the Chemical Weapons Convention. So it demands a strong international response. The third priority is to take a more global approach. This is nothing new. We are in Afghanistan in response to a global challenge, terrorism. We have partnerships across the globe, from Colombia to Australia. So we already have a global approach. But the challenges we face now require us to do even more. NATO is a regional alliance and will remain a regional alliance. But we need to work even more closely with like-minded countries and organizations to remain competitive in a more competitive world, to strengthen our security, and to defend the global rules-based order and the multilateral institutions that have kept us safe for decades. This is important, for instance, when we deal with disinformation campaigns, cyber threats, terrorism, threats from space, or even a pandemic like the one we are facing today. No country alone can tackle these challenges, not even NATO alone. It requires a global effort. It is also important to work together and leverage our partnerships in our approach to China. The rise of China is fundamentally shifting the global balance of power. It is on course to become the world's largest economy, and it is rapidly becoming a global leader in new technology. It already has the world's second largest defense budget, and it is investing heavily in new capabilities, including missiles that can reach all NATO allies. China does not hesitate to use its economic and diplomatic weight to intimidate trading partners and private companies, and to advance its alternative vision of a world order both at home and abroad. The rise of China can provide new opportunities for cooperation and commerce. But we must be clear-eyed about the challenges and not compromise on our values of fairness, transparency, and respect for a rules-based international order. I come to my final point. NATO 2030 is about the future of our alliance. That is why I'm determined to take the ideas and concerns of today's youth into consideration. Already next year, I will engage with universities. Already next week, I will engage with universities, students coming from 10 different universities across the alliance. I will discuss with them the new challenges that NATO is facing, including climate change and its impact on our security. The young people I will engage are the leaders of tomorrow, and the ones that will deal with the decision we make today. So we must involve them in our reflection and invite them to help shape what will be ultimately their alliance and their future. So, ladies and gentlemen, the three priorities I have just outlined are key to make our strong alliance even stronger and to prepare it for the unexpected. Because in uncertain and turbulent times, a strong NATO matters more than ever. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alina. And thank you, Secretary General Stoltenberg. CEPA looks forward to continuing to work to support NATO's work on strengthening the alliance. And now, please stay tuned. And now it is my pleasure to welcome today's panel, The Emerging World Order in a Disrupted Era. It is my honor to introduce distinguished moderator Steve Erlinger, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and New York Times Global Chief Correspondent. Steve, over to you.
Thank you, Geisha, very, very much. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be here, however, virtually. We do have a very good panel for you. And I want to compliment Alina for putting all of this together so well. Our title, we only have an hour, so we will try to move fairly quickly. And just in case you don't know who everyone is, I will very briefly say, we have a panel including Francis Fukuyama, who is at the Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University. We have Ivan Krastyev, who is chairman of the Center for Liberal Strategies in Sofia and Vienna, I think. We have Ambassador Victoria Nuland, who has been I knew in Russia many, many years ago and since, and who is with the Albright Stonebridge Group and the Center on the US and Europe at the Brookings Institution, and Cory Shockey, defense expert, director, foreign and defense policy studies from the American Enterprise Institute. It's a great panel, and I'm thrilled to be trying to animate you. Just to start off, I thought I would just ask you to talk a little bit about how the world has changed. And maybe it's not changed as much as we think, but this is the first question. I mean, what in the transatlantic relationship do you think has really altered in a fundamental way in the last 6 years or so, even before Trump took office? And what hasn't changed? And in fact, if things have been damaged, what do you think is most easily repairable? I think that's a very good way to start. I hope so. So Frank, why don't you begin?
Okay, thank you very much, Steve. I would say if you step back a little bit and think about what's changed, it's really an American decline in terms of geopolitical weight. Normally, domestic politics is weakly connected to foreign policy because most domestic voters don't care that much about foreign policy, and it's an area of discretion for presidents. But in this case, I think that there's a single fact that's going on that shapes the US role in world politics, which is the polarization that's overtaken the US. I mean, right now we're seeing it just in a particularly intense form after the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, which is going to set the stage for the November election. And I'm afraid that this polarization is not going to disappear if Joe Biden is elected. In certain ways, it could be just as bad, especially if the Republicans continue to hold the Senate and he is elected president. I think you'll end up with the same kind of deadlock you had with the last 6 years of the Obama presidency. But even if the Democrats win both houses of Congress and the presidency, you still have, roughly 35–40% of the country that are very committed Trump voters. And I think that the level of anger, potential violence, you can already see a huge fight brewing over the election itself. I mean, we used to, Toria and I were both on the board of the National Endowment for Democracy, which used to go around trying to advise transitioning and developing countries on their elections. And it's not clear to me that we can hold a really free and fair election ourselves in November. And this is something that will probably continue way past November 3rd. So for all of these reasons, I think that everybody is adjusting to this fact that the United States is crippled by the fact that Americans simply don't agree with each other about the most basic premises, and including issues like the degree to which the United States should be involved in the world, with NATO, with Europe, and the like. So that, I think, is a general overview.
That's good. That's quite a good start, because it just seems to me one of the big questions we'll talk about is the consistency of American foreign policy and whether, in fact, people can have any confidence still. We used to say that divisions end at the water's edge. Corey, do they end there anymore? What do you think? What's changed? Unmute. There you go.
Don't end at the water's edge now. You know, I always gnash my teeth at the mythologizing of the past as though things used to be easier than they are now. But I do think there are important things that are different. I agree with Frank that US abdication is the most important change, not just abdication of leadership in an international order, but even participation by the rules that have shaped that order. It really is a shocking change in a pretty short period of time. Second thing I think is different is that compared to 6 years ago, Russia is much more emboldened to work inside our countries. Its interference in the 2016 election, its continuing efforts to corrode confidence in the American electoral system, the poisoning of the Novichok poisonings, not just in Britain, but also recently of Navalny. Russia really thinks it has a winning hand, even though it has a very weak hand. And we are not being nearly assertive enough to dissuade them of that. Third thing I think is different is that China is overtly seeking to break both transatlantic and inter-European solidarity. And they're doing it by bribery, and it's succeeding. If you look at the way Hollywood neglects to, the way Hollywood trims its sails on everything because they're frothing at the mouth for the chance at the Chinese market. And the fact that no other Western company has been able to successfully navigate into the Chinese market doesn't dissuade them. And I think that's a real cause for concern. Fourth thing that's different and negative, I think German singularity is being heightened. The difference in their attitudes about refugees compared to other Western countries is quite admirable, but that's changing German politics in ways that scare us and others because of Germany's singular past. So they are the dominant decision maker. France can strut all it cares to. Unless you can deliver Germany, you can't deliver Europe. And that was less clear, I think, 6 years ago than it is now. The last negative trend, I think, is we underestimated the difficulty of post-communist transitions, even in Europe. And I think Dalibor Rohac's work has been really important in helping me understand how much better the countries that overtly repudiated their past and had the basis for doing that have fared relative to others. Four things, though, that I think are positive changes in the last 6 years. The continuing success of the European Monetary Union. Given how difficult it is, how varied the experience of different countries is, that they continue to believe that they fare better economically with a common currency and that they have staved off market runs on it is a huge success. Second positive trend, a growing realization in the US and especially in European countries of what China is attempting to do and the need for us to acknowledge and band together to deal with it. Third, increased defense spending by European countries after Russia's invasion of Crimea. That will eventually, with an American president less incendiary than the current one, help explain to my mom the continuing value of the alliance. And lastly, since the end of the Cold War, it has been a temptation for European countries to castigate the United States for our many failures, all of which are on rampant display right now. But the realization that the US actually is playing on the same team as European countries and is fundamentally different from China in how it views its relationships with other countries, particularly countries that share our values. I actually think that's a really important distinction.
Great, great, much appreciated. Sometimes it always feels like it comes down to Hollywood and to mom, right? I mean, those are our source points. Yvonne, you've written a lot about the impact of '89 and some of the great disappointments that have followed. What's your sense of what's changed? Is Central Europe moving in a different direction from Brussels in a way that won't change, or that in a way that might actually make Brussels a more open, easier place? And what does the possibility of American inconsistency do you think, to people's worldview?
Listen, if you go 6 years ago, even if Trump was not elected, certain things in the transatlantic relations were going to change for two very kind of clear reasons. One is that the role of Europe in the global politics has changed. Obviously, Asia has become more important than Europe, and it was clear to everybody. So transatlantic relations was not going to be as structurally important as it was during the Cold War. And secondly, obviously, European Union, after all this enlargement, becoming a very big market, have been much more ambitious, looking for much more kind of equal partnership with the US compared with the previous periods. But with the Trump's elections, and I do believe also COVID-19 speed up certain processes, several things have changed. One is President Trump is the first American president who is not sure that European unity is in the strategic interest of the United States. And this is where basically he stands, and this is what Europeans basically understood. And for the Europeans, this is a situation in which we suddenly ended up being surrounded by three great powers who are not particularly interested in the European unity. I mean, Russia, obviously, China, and the United States under President Trump. And the problem is that if out of three there is one which is really capable to split European Union, this is the United States, for sure. Secondly, what I do believe has happened both to the US and the EU is that the very image, in a certain way, hegemony, in my view, is like beauty. This is in the eyes of the beholder. So even if your actual power has not changed, the way both the United States and Europe are perceived outside has changed a lot. And by the way, as a result of the COVID-19, European Council on Foreign Relations has a recent survey, we show also a major crisis of the image of the United States in the eyes of the Europeans. This is not simply about President Trump this time, and this is not about the intentions of the United States, this is about the capacity of the United States. This is the first global crisis in which the United States did not play any leadership role, it was absent. And secondly, basically many Europeans felt pity for the United States, and this is the only feeling that Europeans have never been kind of having towards the United States. And I do believe as a result of it, we're in a kind of a very difficult situation, because for the Europeans also this crisis was particularly painful, because to a certain extent, European Union more than any other player was very much kind of dependent on the existing of the liberal orders. And we made out of the religion of the fact that economic interdependence is basically a major source of security. We are basically on a turning point in which economic interdependency now is much more perceived as a source of insecurity. And I do believe from this point of view, European Union is really looking at these elections in the United States as the most important European elections ever since the establishment of the Union.
Right. Thank you, Yvonne. Toria, do you think these notions of confidence in America, shifts in America, are they overstated, or do they go to the heart of a real change in transatlantic relations and in the trust our allies have for Washington?
Steve, I think you put your finger on it with the word trust. it's one thing if in the Obama administration, some felt that the US was less enthusiastic about its global shaping role than it had been in the past, than it had been in previous post-Cold War decades and Cold War decades. But with Trump coming into office, as everyone here has said, it's not simply an abdication of US leadership and a unilateralism and go it aloneism with regard to the challenges of Russia and China and everything else. It's an actual attack on allies and on democratic systems. Trump is executing an effort to dismantle the very things inside America that always made us the beacon for whether it was Eastern Europe, Central Europe, or other countries around the world. Respect for independent judiciary, respect for free media, respect for free elections, respect for participation. All those things that we went around for 30 years preaching to other countries, and Frank made an allusion to our work together on the National Endowment for Democracy. Don't hire your relatives, don't attack the press, don't try to undercut the independence of other branches of government. Don't be unwilling to divest your assets, expose your assets. All of those things we're doing ourselves, but we're also, as Yvonne said, pitting allies against each other. And we are failing to galvanize the liberal community to deal with today's challenges. And therefore, everybody is left to their own devices. So Corey spoke about the more aggressive Russia, China that is making all kinds of insidious inroads into the transatlantic community and the global community and trying to undercut rules of the road. But just in terms of today's problems, in 2008 and 2009, under a Republican president and a Democratic president, it was the United States that organized the liberal world to recover from economic collapse. And today we're doing none of that. The one threat that has not been put on the table yet is the challenge of the digital revolution. And either we are going to be rule setters or we're going to be rule takers from authoritarians and folks who don't agree with us on an internet that favors freedom. But when the US abdicates the field, as we see, Europe is unable to get its act together. And of course, nobody's mentioned Brexit. So our great partner in defending liberal principles, liberal security, free markets, and the values that brought us together and that are fundamental to being a NATO member, an EU member. When the UK is completely self-absorbed and detached from the European Union and all of those powerful tools, the EU itself begins to look inward, begins to behave like we are behaving, and feels trapped between the United States and China, rather than us galvanizing a team of free and liberal countries, not just in the transatlantic community, but in Asia as well, to deal with all of these challenges, from COVID to the economy, to digital, to China, to Russia, to climate. And so we are just, we are hemorrhaging capacity, and all of the malign forces are taking advantage.
I agree with you.
Defending, not to mention defending democracy within our space as well, which we didn't.
No, absolutely. Sorry to cut you off. It just seems to me, you're right, we have an Anglo-Saxon world that's melting down in its own special way. And I wondered, I was thinking, of course, we can talk about COVID and the impact of COVID, but let's talk about Belarus for a second. I mean, is that a place where American leadership is missing? Is there more that actually the US should be doing? Obviously, we have the experience of Ukraine, and Belarus is right next to Russia. It's not the same, but once again, one feels the sense that there's a popular rebellion, at least in the cities, and the West seems incapable of doing much about it. I mean, should we be doing more about it, or is it better to let it go at its own pace? Anyone who wants, just throw up your hand and start talking. Corey.
I'll take a shot at that.
Please.
I would love to see us doing much more to celebrate and draw attention to brave Belarusians who are under threat from their own government. I would also like to see us do a lot more privately to emphasize to the Russians and drive up the cost to the Russians of their malign interference in it. Sadly, I fear neither of those things are possible in this administration from the executive branch, which means we need to be all the more active, encouraging legislators to take meaningful action, and for us to take meaningful action as civil society, because it's never just the president that controls American foreign policy, and that's one of its great strengths.
Thanks.
I would
Yvonne?
just-
Sorry, Toria, why don't you go ahead, and then Yvonne. Apologies. Toria, go ahead.
You know, Belarus is difficult because it's never completely escaped and developed as much of an independent political identity, economic identity as the other post-Soviet republics. But one of the things that's disturbed me about this period is all of the tools we appear to be using are purely punitive. You know, let's sanction this, you know, dude and that dude who couldn't care less whether they can ever come to Paris or Washington again. We don't see the liberal world led by the US and the EU coming together with an affirmative package of support for a Belarus that would rerun this election with clean international or OSCE observers. So there's no affirmative incentive. There's no welcoming of these folks who want to live better, live with dignity, as the Ukrainians used to say, into our community. We could easily assemble an economic package of support and have it ready for a post-clean election Belarus. Now, it might not work, but we're not giving them any perspective. We're just, just sitting there and saying, oh, it's so hard.
Yvonne.
I'm going to be less critical on the American administration in this particular case for a very simple reason. It is not accidentally that you're not going to see European or American flags on this protest in Belarus. Protesting people basically are very much afraid this to be perceived as a classical geopolitical clash. They're very much aware of asymmetry of the relations and basically the fear of the Russian troops going in Belarus. So from this point of view, I see a lot of kind of similarities with people on the street with the behavior, for example, of Czechoslovakia in 1968, or even Poland in 1981, because we talk that there are no sphere of influence, but in a certain way, there are spheres of influence, and Belarusians know that they're in the Russian sphere of influence because of the treaty. So from this point of view, I do believe that the American administration, from this point of view, was quite aware that trying to make it over geopolitical can hurt and not help. And I do believe Steve Biegun was on time in Moscow, basically exactly to say this. Mm-hmm. Do you really want to become the hostage of a mad dictator who is for 26 years running the country? And are you going to turn basically a normally not anti-Russian population into an anti-Russian one? But I agree with something different. We started to be interested in Belarus only when people went on the street. One of the interesting story was that Belarus came as a surprise. Everything is coming as a surprise. So from this point of view, I don't believe that the problem was what was the reaction before. The problem was that obviously we all are not understanding very well the dynamics in these societies. And this is where I see much more as a problem than I don't believe that simply coming with a louder voice or doing this or that was going to make it easier for the opposition and the Belarus. And if you see, they're also very careful themselves to say, we are for regime change. We are not claiming at the moment that we are for a geopolitical change.
Right. What we need is a Belarusian pope, but unfortunately we don't have one. the way we had a Polish Pope. Having covered his trips to Poland, they were some of the most moving events of my entire life.
But can I make one point, which is slightly more ironical, but
please.
People on the street, you can see one thing that Lukashenko has succeeded. He created a Belarusian nation. He created a Belarusian nation on the street, claiming to him, you cannot represent us. And also, for the first time in all these counter revolutions, you see the workers as the major players, and basically we're talking about what is going to happen in all these big state-owned companies and so on. So from this point of view, there is something kind of interesting about Belarusia, where you can see 1968 back, you can see 1980 back with solidarity, but unfortunately, you also see 1989 back, but not 1989 in Eastern Europe, but 1989 in China. Because also you can see that you have an East European regime that is sure that they can use power against a totally peaceful demonstrations, something that was the most distinctive feature of 1989. The idea was that it can never happen in Europe.
And of course, also, we're not going to go to war for Minsk. Frank, please.
Yeah, so I think it's important to keep in mind from Putin's standpoint what's at stake in Belarus. And so there's really two separate issues. So the first is the geopolitical one, whether this is going to affect the balance of power in Europe and so forth. But the second one is really an existential one for him, which is the emergence of this broad anti-regime mobilization across the whole of the country that emerged very suddenly. And that's something that could happen in Russia. And I think that that's really the most important thing for him. So I agree with Yvonne that it is probably a good thing that we're not tweaking him with the geopolitical threat. But I think you have to keep in mind that, even if there's no geopolitical threat, the stakes for him are still extremely high, that Lukashenko is not overthrown. And therefore, I'm not sure that, anything that is done on the outside is really going to affect, that basic calculus.
Right. Though I do think Putin probably thinks we're involved anyway, as he was sure we did the Maidan and that we've done the demonstrations against him after his second presidency and so on. This is part of the way he thinks. But that lets me to a topic I did want to bring up, which is Russia says it's cutting defense spending soon because of its economic problems. Its population shrinking, the whole tale. Do we worry too much about Russia? What kind of threat does Russia really represent to us now? Or is it just easier for us to keep thinking of Moscow as this huge, dangerous problem for us? Now, you've identified the internal questions. I mean, the meddling, which is real, and disinformation. But are we putting our deterrence money in the wrong place? I just throw that open as a question. I mean, Putin looks weaker and more anxious. Not that he's going to disappear tomorrow, not like, but it doesn't look like a country that is 100% behind him anymore. Anybody?
I will. I'll
Please.
take that bait.
Okay, take the bait.
No, I don't think we're putting our deterrence money in the wrong place by focusing it on China and Russia. I think it would be a mistake not to include Russia in the states that are of major defense concern to us. China's climate change and Russia's a bad storm now, right? You're right about the long-term trends being negative for Russia in virtually every aspect: demography, economy, all that stuff. But what Russia is willing to do that China so far mostly is not, is to move aggressively into any space we leave like Syria, to use their declining and middling military power to strategic advantage, to try and reshape the order in a way hostile to the interests of free countries. And that's why I think we should still be worried about it. A second thing I would emphasize is that it's true Russia is going to be forced to cut defense spending, but they are at the end of an aggressive 10-year modernization program. So they are cutting now, but they've made major investments in ways we should be quite concerned about and need to increase our own defense spending, at least in those targeted areas, to be able to match and find ways to deal with.
What else on this, Yvonne?
Yeah. Listen, I also agree that also the situation is changing slightly with the major disruption that comes with the COVID-19. Because there is one major difference between Russia and China. Chinese, rightly or wrongly, believes that time works for them. On the other side, basically, particularly President Putin believes that in the long run, time does not work for him. So he wants to fix the position of Russia as an important player in his lifetime. So from this point of view, nevertheless, that you have a totally different capacity between China and Russia, also when it comes to the economy, technology, and others, Russia is going to be much ready to take higher risks than basically China is ready to be. And I do believe now when you look back, when President Trump came, he has this kind of strategic intuition that it is possible to separate China and Russia. 4 years later, I do believe this illusion is over. And I do believe this is a major change which should be taken seriously. But while China and Russia probably are closer than ever before, also in military terms, one of the interesting stories, and this is something that worries me personally a lot, is we're going to have the next 6 or 8 months, in my view, being one of the most dangerous periods in Europe, but also globally that we're talking about. Obviously, the United States is going to be totally preoccupied with the elections, what is going to happen after the elections, this kind of an expectations that the election results are going to be contested one way or the other. This basically created a situation for anybody who wants to take the initiative and make a point that this is the time to do it. And also, honestly, after the Navalny case, there is nothing much to be broken in the Europe-Russia relations. I do believe that for reasons that I don't understand fully, but what happened with Navalny, I mean, is totally destroyed, particularly the German-Russian relations. It changed the public opinion in Germany. Obviously, there was a very strong personal relations on the side of the Chancellor and the German president. So from this point of view, I do believe that we can expect in a short term, Russia to decide to make a point. To make a point of basically that it cannot be simply ignored, and that the sanctions are not going to change its position. And I don't know to what extent the West is prepared for it. Because honestly speaking, both in America, but also in Europe, when we talk about Russia, we're much more talking about our own domestic politics. I do believe we slightly lost Russia in the perspective. In America, the talk about Russia is very much the talk about Trump. In Europe, it's about the support for the populist parties and others. I mean, what the Russia is doing in our domestic politics. But Russia probably is going to use this kind of a moment of its own, be it in the Middle East, be it in the post-Soviet space. And I don't believe that anybody on the Western side is very much ready, basically, to respond.
Right, right. I mean, one can see this with Turkey also. We can see it with China. You see people, China on the Indian border, China in the South China Sea, Turkey in Libya, Syria, taking advantage somehow of a sense of vacuum. And no one seems to be stepping up. Does anyone expect this to change under a Biden presidency? Should there be a Biden presidency? Do you think there would be a more assertive American foreign policy, at least to fill these vacuums, or are we done with all that?
I think there will certainly there will certainly be an effort to rally a community of free nations together to stand up to these challenges jointly. Back on the Russia point, I think it's interesting that Putin has to declare, and I think he's doing it for his domestic audience, that he's going to stop spending money on weapons because they're not interested anymore in these great adventures. It's not bringing the glory that it brought over the last 8 years is not there anymore. And instead, they're just asking why he's spending money in Syria and Libya and elsewhere rather than on their schools and their hospitals, et cetera. I've thought for some time that Putin is far more deterrable and containable in his malign behavior than we have been willing to test. You know, when you put troops in the Baltic states and Eastern Europe, that threat abates. But when you disappear from Syria and Libya, he moves into the vacuum and becomes the strategic partner of our NATO ally, Turkey. And, you know, simply by exposing the amount of Russian money that is going into these foreign adventures versus going into things that Russians want, could add to the pressure on him. But the other point I wanted to make here is one that Yvonne walked towards, which is that he's also continuing the process that he began of fueling populism, but also buying politicians and judges and strategic infrastructure and laundering money all over Eastern Europe in such a way that more and more of our allies are corrupted by Russia. And we see it from Bulgaria now. I worry about your country, Yvonne, all up the Eastern European littoral to what happens in Cyprus, et cetera. So, you know, I think this threat is insidious, but not insurmountable if we had our act together.
Thank you. Frank, did you want to come in on this?
Well,
only if you want to.
No, I do want to. I know we want to pivot to China at some point, and this might be an appropriate moment because I think that Yvonne is exactly right, that if you think about China and Russia and which is the larger threat, to me, there's just never been a question that in the long run, China is the much bigger challenge because it's got a very modern economy. It's going to be bigger than ours, if not already, you know, very soon, across the technology spectrum. And Russia just doesn't pose that kind of challenge. But Putin is a risk taker. You know, I wrote my PhD dissertation on Soviet threats to intervene in Middle Eastern conflicts. And the bottom line of that was that they were just really cautious. You know, they would threaten to intervene, but they'd kind of wait until the moment when the crisis had really passed before making their threats, so they knew they wouldn't have to carry them out. Putin has just, I mean, he's made that dissertation completely irrelevant because he has injected forces into Syria, into Venezuela, into all of these places that no Soviet leader would ever have done. To the point where I actually think it's being very counterproductive. I mean, why poison Navalny? You know, it's crazy. He's endangering Nord Stream as a result of this. And so I think that it creates a big threat in the short run because he's just willing to take a much higher level of risk. But in a certain way, it's also, you know, kind of self-defeating because people can see that and, you know, they're pushing back.
Steve, can I make a very small point? Because I do believe this is something which is important in a long term. Because the United States and China, for different reasons, are going to be much more constrained. America for domestic issues, but to be honest, China, because of its neighbors, because of its new role, obviously they're going to be. We are going to see a huge activism from the middle powers. Turkey and Russia are a great example. They are much more going to go into the vacuum. And from this point of view, when Toria said he's losing money in Syria, he's losing money, but also he's gaining money. Because by interfering in the way he's interfering, he's persuading Saudis to buy Russian arms. He basically had a totally different role in the oil producing community. So in a certain way for the Russians, this is showing their daring to take missions which others are not doing, is also the economic strategies. I was talking to a senior Russian official some time ago and saying about the asymmetry between China-Russia relations. And he made an interesting point, which of course is flattering for Russia, but is interesting to be quoted. He said, listen, you're right, China is much bigger, much more influential. But he said, don't forget our relations is like the relations between Germany and France, because we have a strategic culture that they don't have. We are ready basically to go outside. We are ready to interfere in a conflict in which China is always going to stay away. And I do believe this new world in which taking risk is going to be perceived as a much more attractive policies, not only for Russia, but for many others. This is the world which I do believe Biden is going to inherit. And the truth is, particularly from the European point of view, Europeans really fear Trump being re-elected. I mean, at least the mainstream Europeans, the Europeans that also like it. Mr. Orban yesterday totally declared his support for President Trump. But on the other side, there is not over expectations on the European side on what Biden is going to do. And also what is interesting, and I do believe, Steve, you touched on this, Europeans for the first time are afraid that there are no foreign policy consensus in the United States. Every new administration can mean a totally different policy.
Absolutely.
For you, this is the nightmare.
Yeah, and also people are very nervous that Biden might actually ask them to do things that they can't say no to.
Yeah.
You know, that they're going to be obligated. Let's switch
Steve,
to. Yes, go ahead.
2 quick points on that.
Yes, and then we'll go to China. Go, please. Go ahead.
I think Ivan is a little bit overstating what Russia gained by intervening in Syria vis-a-vis the Gulf states. Because, for example, it's true that the Saudis may buy Russian arms, but the Saudis also drove a ruthless bargain against the Russians on oil prices. I mean, forcing Putin to capitulate and accept cuts 4 times what they had originally proposed. So I wouldn't overstate the extent to which Russia, by intervening in Syria, is changing the calculations of other middle powers. And the second thing, on a Biden presidency, I do think there will be a huge sigh of relief among America's allies, not just in Europe, but also in Asia, if Vice President Biden is elected. But I would simply caution that he too is a retrenching foreign policy and defense policy president, as Trump is, as Obama was, but to a greater extent, because he has actually advocated some really bad decisions along the way that were never taken up. And so he may ask Europeans for support on things that are also outside the general framework that we have accepted in transatlantic relations. And as people raise, that will make it very hard for Europeans to say no to. Let me just conclude that by saying that overwhelmingly, a Biden presidency would be more advantageous for American national security and American foreign policy.
And it sounds like the British government has just discovered that Joe Biden is an Irish American, which seems to shock them terribly on Brexit. Listen, on China, obviously Xi Jinping has his own vulnerabilities. There's a lot of inequality. There's a lot of rural-urban tensions. There's a lot of money being spent. There's a lot of debt. There's a lot of problems, right? But the big question I think everyone has as China rises, and Xi has been pretty explicit about what it is China wants. Do you think what China wants is something that can be accommodated? Or do you think there are certain areas where the West really does have to say, no, this is a red line? And the other question, of course, is, does a challenge make us better somehow? I mean, does it encourage initiative and brand new thinking? which has been part of the problem. So again, I throw that open. Anyone who wants to begin to talk about China, what does it want? How dangerous is it? And should we start worrying about Taiwan in the next 10 years or so? Those are the questions.
So again, I'll take the first swing
Good
at
for
it.
you. Thank you.
I do not think China can continue to rise without either liberalizing itself and becoming buying into the existing order, the Zelig formula of responsible stakeholder, or it will have to change the rules. Because for me, the mystery is why China acted in ways now that activated the antibodies against its continued rise, that expose the extent to which its state-owned companies get to operate by a different set of rules, expose the extent to which thefts of intellectual property. I mean, why didn't they wait until they had won the AI race and locked in their advantages? Why didn't they wait until the Trump administration destroyed America's alliances before reinforcing them with its own behavior? And the only answer that seems to me to fit the majority of Chinese behavior is they think they're in a hurry. We often credit them with being 100-year strategists and marathon runners, and none of answer the question of why to have reaction now. And so I think they think they're in a hurry. And for me, the argument that makes the most sense about why they think they're in a hurry is because they either need to change the rules or they cannot continue to succeed. And so that I think is the explanation. And we can't continue to prosper if we let them change the rules.
Right,
and
Steve?
I think the middle powers understand that even better than the United States does, and have actually, to Yvonne's earlier point, done a pretty good job of trying to band together and cooperate and find new ways of thinking. The most important set of changes, I think, have come from Japan, which is training the coast guards of Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Vietnam, is cascading military equipment to those countries. And that not only helps Japan get word unwillingness to acknowledge its World War II atrocities, but it helps build capacity in others. In fact, they are adopting some of America's best ideas as they deal with the rising China.
Frank?
Yeah, so on your question about Taiwan, I think absolutely it's threatened. Xi Jinping gave a speech at the beginning of 2019 in which he basically said, we are going to reabsorb Taiwan within a decade, and if we can't do it peacefully, we will use force. And I just, for some reason, nobody takes this seriously, but I think that this is the direction things are going. If you think about it from his standpoint, with the United States weakened and with it thrashing about, destroying its relationship with its allies, there probably isn't a better time to start contemplating something like this. And the Taiwanese, I think, unfortunately, have been a bit feckless about their own defense. They kind of take for granted that it's going to be done by the United States. So yes, I think that is a very live possibility, and it's going to come sooner rather than later.
Yeah, and certainly the Chinese have been engaged in a big military buildup. I mean, both nuclear, which is really new because it used to be a quite small nuclear force, but also in weapons that can attack American carriers and so on. So, I mean, this is one of the things, I mean, most people think it's a few years away, it's not tomorrow, but I take what Xi Jinping tends to say pretty seriously. So, Yvonne, Toria, you go first.
I just wanted to agree with Frank that I think they perceive weakness, and that's why they're moving fast. They withstood, the big break comes when Xi Jinping, as leader, decides that, no, he doesn't want to be a responsible stakeholder in the system that we built. He wants to, in the first instance, corrode that system, but in the second instance, rebuild it in a way that favors China and sets out to do that. But I think having survived the early years of a Trump unilateral onslaught and the sanctions, et cetera, perhaps better than we survived them, if you ask American farmers today, et cetera, she is looking at how long it's going to take us to rebuild or whether we will rebuild, and wants to get facts on the ground. Look at what happened with Hong Kong over the summer, where while we were all obsessed with COVID and our economic collapses, he moved very decisively to essentially break what was left. Now there's still protesting, obviously, in Hong Kong, but when you start taking activists up to Beijing for prison and trial, you get de facto what you couldn't get in the LegCo. And now he can turn his attention to Taiwan, and he very much has his eye on Europe and the ability to make inroads, whether they are buying of strategic infrastructure, whether they are mastering the technology, whether they are now beginning to corrupt politicians, as we see even in the UK. And so the question becomes how quickly. I do think it's a wake-up call. I do think it's important that there's now an American bipartisan consensus that we need a more structured and organized and unified with allies policy towards China. I don't think we'll get that from Trump. There's too much vanity in it, and there's too much unilateralism in it. It will be a very, very heavy lift for a Biden administration, especially because Democratic side is still, I think, split in terms of whether it can return China to responsible stakeholderism or whether you're fundamentally moving towards deterrence, and how that would play out, and whether you can unify the various issues from trade to defense of the seas and all of those things to defense of allies in Asia, et cetera.
Great. Yvonne, you want to just come in?
I just want to make three very brief points. One is that we all the time basically see this new type of a more aggressive China policy, totally based on the figure of the leader in the Communist Party. But I do believe that there is one new phenomenon that we should take seriously. You do not have simply a revisionist regime, but you have a revisionist public opinion. You have publics that feel self-confident, that wants basically to go outside and to show. And capacity is very much defines intentions. And from this point of view, it's quite interesting because COVID-19 had a very strong impact on this. I was following some of the public opinion polls being done by independent non-Chinese agency. And one of the results of this is, for the first time, I do believe, the majority of the Chinese believe that their system is better than our system. Yeah. Before, they were kind of enjoying what they're getting, but they were not very much sure. For example, the perception of the United States, the effectiveness of the American model, have been collapsed not because of simply a polarization, but because of the way the United States responded to the COVID-19. And this is going to have a long-term implications because you're going to have a public demand for much more confrontational politics. And when it comes to Europe, to be honest, Europe is not excited about kind of the Cold War between the United States and China, because for Europe, to be honest, it means that this level of sovereignty that Europeans have gained for the last years is going to disappear. So, of course, as a result of it, Europe is facing very uneasy choices. On one side, Europeans are not naive anymore about where China stands, and we see the threat coming from China. On the other side, basically, I do believe that they're going to be pushed on European side, that at least when it coming to the economic relations, they should be slightly much more partnership. And this is why Trump's policy toward China was not appealing to the Europeans.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of anxiety about being.
We have a choice, caught. And the choice is not to wait what Biden is going to ask for us,
right,
but go first to Biden, even using the Munich Security Conference at this very early period, because from the economic point of view, this is critically important. And I could be wrong, but I do believe that if they're going to be this major confrontation, probably technology is going to play the role that ideology played in the classical Cold War. And from this point of view, all this debate on the 5G is not so different than the Marshall Plan debate. Tell me what your 5G network is, and I'm going to tell you where you belong. And this is an important story. And by the way, not easy for Europe, particularly not easy for Germany, because don't forget, 42% of all European exports to China comes from Germany.
It's €1 billion a day.
Yeah.
In two-way trade. No, that's right. So part of the question, since you bring up technology, there's a lot of talk about decoupling from China. Do you think that's actually possible, or is China already decoupling from us, which is what I suspect? And does it matter? I mean, China has its own Amazon, it has its own Facebook, it has its own, chatting system, and it controls what people know very, very effectively. And this is partly the use of fake news, it's the editing of news. It's very hard sometimes among Chinese youth to get them really interested in even having a VPN to see what the other world thinks. So what about decoupling? I mean, does this make America stronger? Does it make it weaker? Is it possible to actually do it in a way that matters? Or is this a sort of ludicrous idea people are throwing around?
No,
So
I would say,
doing some work with Jim Mattis, Jim Ellis, and Joe Felter on rare earths, because those are a particular Chinese chokehold. And we wanted to look at, is it possible? What would it look like? Is it a potential model for limited decoupling in particularly crucial spheres? Because you're right, Steve. I mean, one of the ways a liberal world China confrontation, and I disagree with Yvonne here that this is a US-China problem, because China is not just rising for the United States, as Espen Barth Elda always tells us, it's rising for Europe too. And but with rare earths, it's going to require some government investments. It's going to require paying attention. It's going to require overcoming local opposition to mining and processing in specific places, but it is absolutely doable. Our challenge is that the economics wouldn't produce the national security outcome that we need. But the national security outcome that we need isn't autarky. It isn't bringing everything to the US. It's reliable supply chains that have a multiplicity of paths. China can be one of those paths. It can't be the entirety. We can't be path dependent on China. And in certain strategic areas, it's not easy to do, but it's not insurmountable to do. It just requires good.
Right. I think that's actually been one of the COVID lessons, which is manufacturing a lot of things too dependent on China. Toria, you wanted to come in. We don't have tons of time left, so I would just ask everybody to be terse.
I was just going to say that on the economic side, I don't think it's about decoupling. I think it's about diversification. I think our industries are beginning to do that. But I think on the digital side, in addition to the challenges of China infiltrates and brings us into their networks and infiltrates ours, that we're essentially fueling their AI and quantum machine. I think there's a real danger of the information that they're acquiring on citizens. We know what they do with it at home. They use it to control individuals and their behavior. And that's a real risk. I'm constantly reminding my children that every time you sign on to TikTok, you're fueling your file in Beijing.
And maybe your file too, by the way. So I have one last quick question for you. We've only got a couple of minutes left. Is this century still the American century, or is it something else? Frank, what do you think?
Oh, it's definitely not the American century. Like I said, I think the single most important geopolitical fact is the decline of American geopolitical weight, of the American model. And I just think it's going to take a long time to recover from where we are right now.
Yvonne, what do you think?
Listen, we're too early in the century.
Yes, the French Revolution wasn't all that long ago. I know.
So I'm more positive. I think my sense is that the structural factors of American strength are incredibly durable, and it would be very difficult to displace them. So it may be that chaos ensues, but I doubt it will mean the rise of an alternative. And I would bet my money that American ability to rejuvenate ourselves and the structural strengths will mean that the 21st century does remain an American century.
Victoria?
I do believe we are in, you can call it an ideological competition, you can call it a political competition, a structural competition between liberalism and autocracy. I have continual optimism in the ability of liberalism to reinvent, but we have to choose to do so, and we have to choose to defend our way of life. And, you know, I think we'll know sooner rather than later whether the American people are up for that challenge.
Yeah, I think that's a very good place to end. I always think that vacuum creates order eventually, and it's really up to us, more than China, more than Russia, to shape that order. I still think personally we have it in us with our allies, if our allies can get their act together too. So I just want to thank you all. You've been brilliant. It's been a lot of fun for me, and I think it's a great start to this very important conference. So thank you all, and I'll hand back to our moderator.
Wonderful. Thank you, Steve, and thank you to all the panelists for that fantastic discussion. I'd also like to thank our supporters for this conference: NATO Public Diplomacy Division, Lockheed Martin Corporation, Bell Helicopter, American Friends of Czech Republic, and Friends of Slovakia. I'd also like to encourage all of you to tune in tomorrow for our Transatlantic Defense and Security Day, where we will hear from Senator Jane Brish, Senator Cory Booker, and Polish Defense Minister Błaszczak. Please send us your questions using hashtag CEPA Forum or go to cepaforum.org and let us know what you'd like our panelists to talk about. Have a fantastic day, and thank you for tuning in.
Russia maintains its pressure in our Central European region, developing an offensive military potential.
As nations with authoritarian ideologies and imperial tendencies increasingly look to grow their power and influence on the world stage, we remain committed to the original pledge made by all NATO allies.
We know this historic partnership is not static or inevitable. It must be an ongoing effort to strengthen the bonds that unite us.
As we face open questions about the value and purpose of the transatlantic bond, we have a duty to restore and revitalize the transatlantic defense cooperation that has kept us free and at peace for the last 7 decades.